For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. I'm speaking to activist and author Terry Crawford-Browne about his recently published expose of the diamond industry titled Eye on the Diamonds. Before turning to your latest book, it is worth remembering that in your 2007 book, Eye on the Money, you exposed corruption in post-apartheid South Africa's arms deal. You followed this up by filing arms deal-related perjury and money laundering charges against then Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel. Can you tell us what happened with this case?
Nothing. I filed a complaint in 2008, and of course it was buried. But the Seriti Commission has just called for submissions by the end of July, and I've made my submission about 3 weeks ago, and included in the documentation I have sent are 47 pages of 255 pages of the loan agreements signed by Trevor Manuel for the BAE contracts, so the Barclays Bank ECGD contracts. Now, you know there's all the uproar regarding Barclays Bank. And I received these loan agreements in 2002, and a couple of weeks later ran into Trevor Manuel at a coffee shop in Sandton and told him, I got these loan agreements, you know you should not have signed them, I warned you not to sign them. And he hit the sky, the language was blue, and we haven't been on talking terms since. And he was known to be opposed to the arms deal in the early stages, but he succumbed to pressure, and it's his signature on the documents. And sorry, the Minister of Finance is not a flunky. He's got to take responsibility, and his refusal to sign the loan agreements would have essentially kiboshed the arms deal. And we now a parallel is now that the Minister of Finance refuses to sign for the President's new bling plane, etc. So Trevor Manuel was warned that the arms deal was just fraught with problems. And as Andrew Feinstein reports in his book, Trevor Manuel called him in and tried to get him to close down the investigation in Parliament, saying, well, we know all about Joe Modise, etc., etc. Well, sorry, the Minister of Finance has a fiduciary responsibility to have his eyes open for corruption. And South Africa's commitments to the OECD, the Organization for Cooperation and Development, which is the umbrella for bribery commitments. In terms of that, in terms of the Prevention of Organised Crime Act, the penalties for casting a blind eye to money laundering are up to 15 years in jail. And so I've asked the Seriti Commission to look into this, and ask them to investigate perjury and other charges against him. So we'll see what happens. So it's not dead yet.
You allege that South African Communist Party leader Chris Hani was executed because he opposed the arms deal, and that his right-winger executioners were simply useful idiots in this case. Can you substantiate this claim?
Okay, well, the book is dedicated to Becky Jacobs, who was the leader of the whistleblowers. That was his nom de guerre. His actual name was Hassan Solomon, and sadly he died in 2008. So these were his allegations, and I'm simply his voice in this aspect. But there are other journalists who have also substantiated it, and I'm obviously not going to identify them. But the question was whether the arms deal was the payback from Thabo Mbeki to Joe Modise. There had been huge bad blood between Modise and Hani through the 80s, etc. Modise at one point wanted to have Hani executed. Hani was opposed to the arms deal, saying it would divert public resources away from other poverty issues, etc. And supposedly he was on the verge of outing Modise for another corruption scandal. But then the issue comes as to whether Clive Derby-Lewis was simply a useful idiot, but also Yanis Wallish, whether he was in fact in the employ of BAE, because and as part of the assassination, and that Clive Derby-Lewis simply got sucked into this, and so it became a convenient thing to blame the white right wing rather than the British armaments industry that was subverting our new democracy in collusion with Joe Modise. Joe Modise was a gangster from his youth. He was involved with the CIA, with the MI6, with the South African Police Service, hugely corrupt all through his exile days. And so the issue is whether by removing Chris Hani and subsequently Cyril Ramaphosa. It was the payback to him from Thabo Mbeki. And the TRC did not come up with a satisfactory explanation to the assassination, and the country almost came apart in April '93 because of it. Thankfully it didn't. But we've never resolved that issue, and the South African Communist Party periodically used to sing to Mbeki, tell us Mbeki who killed Chris Hani. So we don't know, but I'm in this instance simply the voice for Mbeki Jacobs, who died in 2008. But he came to me in 1999. I'd been talking about corruption because I was representing the Anglican Church at the Defence Review in Parliament and saying poverty is the priority, and that offsets were just an invitation to corruption. And so in June '99 he came to me, asked for copies of our documents, and then said, "You're talking about corruption, but we'll tell you where it is." And he was the leader of a group of people. He'd been highly trained in the Soviet Union as an ANC intelligence operative, and then saw what happened when the Soviet Union became Russia and these communist apparatchiks suddenly became super capitalists. He said that's not what the struggle against apartheid was about. And so he became disillusioned as he could see the ANC betraying the struggle. And so he said, the arms deal is just the tip of the iceberg. It's oil deals, it's Kucha, it's Cell C, it's toll roads. Now we come up with toll roads, okay? It's drug dealing, it's money laundering. And the common denominator to this is 10% kickback to the ANC for political protection. And that the people around Joe Modise see themselves as the new financial elite in the post-apartheid South Africa. And as I say, he said this is not what the struggle was about. And why he came to me, because of my connections with Archbishop Tutu and Archbishop Ndungane. And so, I was shattered because it was way beyond what I was talking about, but I could see as a former banker that this could turn South Africa into a centre for organised crime with first world banking facilities and no police. And of course the corruption that has exploded since then. So I briefed Archbishop Ndungane, and he called for a judicial commission of inquiry, and that was just brushed off. And so then I introduced Mbeki to Patrice de Lille, and there was a whole uproar about the Patrice de Lille dossier, etc. So we've gone from there. And unfortunately, Mbeki is no longer with us. But he was involved with a number of things, including exposing Jackie Selebe's involvement with Brett Kebble. A brilliant guy. I couldn't keep tabs on all the things he was up to, and I was just bewildered. But over time, his warnings have been validated, and it needs investigation.
Turning now to your latest book, Eye on the Diamonds, you make the strong claim that in essence every diamond is a blood diamond. Can you explain why you say this?
Okay, well, as far as South Africa is concerned, diamonds were the foundation stone of apartheid. Migrant labour policies in Kimberley followed with Namibia, etc. But diamonds historically are a symbol of conquest. The Koh-i-Noor in India, the Cullinan diamond in South Africa, all the bling and glamour of the British Empire is represented in the crown jewels, etc. And Hollywood actresses, all that glamour. But it was diamonds that funded the development of gold in South Africa, but then it was the migrant labour policies from the Kimberley compounds that really depended on humiliating the labour. And so we took that on board. And sadly, after 125 years plus, we have no jewellery industry in this country. All the profits were simply exported. Now, it was extraordinary that diamonds, which are in such huge proliferation on the west coast, offshore, off the coast of Namaqualand, it was an offence, even a capital offence, for someone unauthorised person to have an uncut stone. You could end up on Robben Island, simply having an uncut stone. If you went into the prohibited areas of Namaqualand or Southwest Africa, you could end up being dead. So South Africa and Southwest Africa essentially became colonies for the Oppenheimers. But then they had difficulty that too many diamonds were being discovered. Kimberley in 1867, Southwest Africa in 1908, Congo in 1907, then Sierra Leone in the 1930s, and subsequently Russia and Australia and Canada, and of course now Zimbabwe. So the problem is there are too many diamonds. So trying to control this monopoly is what De Beers has done over well over 100 years now. And they're now finding that their control of the diamond market went from 95% to about 35% now. The Oppenheimers have last year sold out their 40% investment in De Beers. I think they see the writing on the wall. It's time to get out. The going's been very nice for them, but South Africa has essentially seen no. The people of South Africa have seen no. The diamond miners who finance the education of Rhodes Scholars at Oxford, their families are impoverished. So it's a tragedy that the resources that diamonds have unleashed have not been better applied. And the same is also true of gold. But then you go from there into, because of this monopoly, diamonds become the preferred means of money laundering for Al-Qaeda and others. And then organized crime gets involved. And then we saw blood diamonds in Sierra Leone, and the Liberian War, and Charles Taylor and Naomi Campbell, all the blood diamond saga. But then you've got the extraordinary thing of the glamour of diamonds, with diamonds as the war industry, and James Bond and blah blah. And that's where we're actually moving into now, of diamonds as the war industry, because with high surveillance and the technology, it's the cheapy industrial diamonds rather than the glamour diamonds that are now being used for high energy laser technology and surveillance and drones and whatever. And that's really the concern coming out of Marangi, that if that does prove to be the biggest diamond field in the world, that organized crime is really taking control of it for war purposes. And the Kimberley process that had been set up to control blood diamonds essentially is falling apart.
Some countries, such as Botswana, are very dependent on diamonds for their economic well-being. Are you not concerned that your campaign will damage livelihoods in such countries?
That is, Botswana is the hallmark of a country that supposedly has made has developed, and Botswana has been a success story. On the other hand, many of the San people are being removed from their land. So there's that contradiction as well. Who are the beneficiaries? And Botswana is a very unequal society. So yes, economically, as in globular figures, the Botswana economy has done very well from diamonds. But has it actually come down to assist the people at large? And I think that's a question. And when the San people are being removed, etc., I think it's questionable.
Now, as I understand it, the next book you are planning is called Eye on the Gold. What are you hoping to reveal through this third trilogy? Okay,
again, gold took over from diamonds as the foundation of the South African economy. But we're now seeing the consequences of silicosis and acid water and all those consequences, and the misapplication of the resource to enrich a small proportion of the population rather than using those resources for education, health, etc. And all the warnings of health consequences, silicosis, they were just brushed aside. So now the mining houses have left the country. Anglo American is no longer a South African company, and they're trying to walk away from the consequences. So there are major lawsuits in the offing. We'll see what develops from them. But we've also got to look at South Africa does still have 50% of the gold reserves. But of course our mines are very deep, And so if those, and we're no longer the number one diamond gold producing country, we're number 5 or 6, China's, but we still have 50% of gold reserves. So if the gold price is to rise, and there are commentators who say it could even go to $10,000, could that be the means to revive our economy? But on the other hand, given the depth of the mines, would that be new technology with very few jobs involved? But then do we make sure that the resources are used appropriately? So it's not just for enriching a small elite, but are used for sustainable development. And I think that's been the tragedy of the gold mining industry, that we simply wanted bodies, and there were more bodies. Instead of educating the population, we didn't want to develop the brain, we simply wanted brawn. So that'll be an issue in the future, but I'm also obviously going to be looking at what comes out of the arms deal. And if I can hark back to why this was entitled Eye on the Diamonds, it was because the bribes by BAE were paid through a front company in the Virgin Islands called Red Diamond Trading Company to black diamonds such as Fana Shlangwana. So that was the hook for that. But then Lord Randolph Churchill, when he came to Kimberley in 1891, he looked at the big hole and he said, "All this for the vanity of women." And a woman standing next to him said, "And the vanity of men." And so it's the vanity of men and the war issues related to diamonds that interested me. And so similarly, coming back to gold, how are we going to use those resources better the next time round to make sure that it doesn't create a system such as apartheid with devastating social consequences in the future?
Finally, you were an active campaigner against the apartheid government, including in the campaign for economic and financial sanctions against the apartheid regime. How effective do you think sanctions were in toppling apartheid?
I believe that banking sanctions were the tipping point. Obviously, sanctions had built up over time, sports sanctions, boycotts of South African outspan oranges, etc., etc. But you don't bring down the apartheid government by boycotting oranges. But banking sanctions, I believe, were the last instrument to prevent this country from moving to a path of civil war, which would have devastating economic and personal consequences. We could have had a death toll of millions had it really got out of hand. And so I came to this from a banking background, but also having grown up in Libya, very aware, and next door we had the Algeria War, so very aware how things could have got out of hand. And as regional treasury manager for Nedbank, I was very aware how Nedbank was a preferred sanctions buster for the apartheid government. Our subsidiary in Rhodesia, Robank, had been the means of sanctions busting for UDI Rhodesia. And so we were always being called on to issue phony, fraudulent letters of credit, etc. Fortunately, I refused to sign a letter of credit for the Salem issue in 1979, which was Lloyd's reckons was the worst case of piracy in their history. But in 1985, as the riots and unrest were being exposed on international television, it became more and more difficult to roll over South African loans and banks, Eurodollar loans to South African banks. And we warned general management that this was an increasing problem. And they were totally dismissive. Oh, South Africa's not a banana republic, we're not Brazil or Argentina or Mexico, we've got gold. Gold will always bail us out. And then we had the Rubicon speech in August 1985. We had a financial collapse, the debt standstill. I had a transaction going through the last business day of August 1985 for 120 million Deutschmarks that I'd bought from a company for a ship being sold to East Germany. And we were instructed to pay the dollars in New York, just under $60 million. And our New York bank correspondents seized, they'd lent $200 million to South Africa, and they thought $60 million in hand, and we'll sort out the problems later. They seized our $60 million, and the whole New York banking system fell apart. And so I was a member of the Western Province Council of Churches. I was one of the Anglican Church representatives there. And so the South African Council of Churches said, wow, if we can do this from Cape Town, this is the pressure point. So 6 weeks later, I was sent to New York and Washington by Bears Naudé to meet Desmond Tutu at the United Nations, and that's where we began the Banking Sanctions campaign, which was then taken up by the American Congress with the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, and then the Commonwealth, the United Nations, and then I was asked in '88 to the Commonwealth were looking to how to close the loopholes. So that led to, and we were fortunate that it was the time of perestroika, so they could no longer fly the communist flag. And so it was quite hairy, but things were changing. And with the first President Bush, he wanted to distance himself from President Reagan. And I was asked to go to Washington in April '89. And Archbishop Tutu had been invited, but he didn't want to meet President Bush at that point. Fortunately, I was able to come back with information that convinced him to do so. So President Bush, in fact, said he was distressed about what was happening in South Africa and would like to assist. And then we had the March for Peace in Cape Town in September '89, so the Americans were watching what was happening. Archbishop Tutu had to go to a funeral. The Bishop of Washington died in September '89, so Archbishop Tutu went to the funeral, and the Undersecretary of State for African Affairs asked for a meeting, and the next day issued an ultimatum in the US Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, insisting that, and of course President de Klerk had just come to office at that point, that the American government demanded that President de Klerk should meet the first three of our conditions by the opening of Parliament in February 1990. And the first three of those conditions were the end of the state of emergency, the release of political prisoners, and the unbanning of political organizations. So that was the background to President de Klerk's speech on the 2nd of February 1990. And then the fourth and fifth were repeal of apartheid legislation, and the fifth was constitutional negotiations for a non-racial democracy. So it was really banking sanctions that tipped the balance, because if you didn't have access to New York, you weren't in the world because of the use of the dollar as settlement currency in foreign exchange markets. You know, trade with Japan had to be settled in US dollars. So that really was the tipping point. Obviously, it built up on other issues, and there were parallels with the civil rights movement in the United States. So it was the US, although more noise came out of Europe, it was the US where it was more effective. And yeah, I believe it saved us from what could have been a catastrophe. And yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your fascinating story.
Thank you.